In a room full of records, a man set down his brush. The room itself was small for the weight of what it contained: shelves of wooden tablets, rolls of silk, the accumulated administrative memory of a dynasty still calling itself whole, while the provinces beyond its walls were already choosing their own masters. He had spent his working life here, this archivist of the Zoo Court, cataloging the legal precedents and ceremonial protocols and genealogical claims of a civilization that had once known how to hold itself together and was now, by slow degrees, forgetting. His name, later generations would say, was something like Laozi, Old Master. Though whether this was a name or a title, or simply the reverence of people trying to find a human origin for something that felt too old for human origin, no one has ever been quite certain. What is certain is the gesture, the brush set down carefully, not dropped, not broken, placed. The ink still wet on whatever it had last touched. The gatekeeper at the Western Pass was a man named Yin Shi. He held a position that sounds minor and was not. The western gate of the Zhou domain was where the known world ended and the open country began, where travelers came either from somewhere or toward nowhere, and Yinji had spent years watching both kinds pass through. When the old archivist arrived with his ox and whatever he carried that was not on the ox, the gatekeeper recognized something in the quality of his departure that stopped him, not urgency, something closer to its opposite. He asked the old man to write down what he knew before he passed through and was gone. What came back was 81 short chapters. Some of them are only 8 lines. All of them resist the kind of reading that wants to settle them. This text, the Tao Te Ching, was not composed in a moment of calm prosperity. The world that pressed against the walls of the Zhou court while the archivist kept his records was a world of what later historians would call the Warring States period, nearly 2.5 centuries, from the late 5th century before the Common Era to the 3rd, during which 7 major kingdoms fought for dominance over the territory that had once formed a coherent, if fragile, civilization. Generals calculated, populations moved or were moved. Aristocratic families that had organized the social order for generations were replaced by administrators whose qualification was not lineage but usefulness to whoever currently held military advantage. The hierarchies that had seemed eternal revealed themselves as arrangements, and arrangements, unlike eternities, can be broken. The word the text offered against all this was wo wei. 2 characters. The first, wo, carries the sense of negation, of absence, of without. The second, wei, names something active, purposeful doing, deliberate striving, the exertion of will against the world's resistance. Together they produce a compound that translators have been arguing over ever since, because what the compound names is not inaction, and is not passivity, and is not the absence of movement. The sinologist Roger Ames, who has spent decades working with classical Chinese thought, renders it as something like acting without acting against the grain of things, a phrase that preserves the activity inside the concept and distinguishes it from the ego-driven pushing and forcing that the text describes as the source of most human difficulty. This rendering matters because it holds open what simpler translations close, that Wu Wei is not about stopping, but about a particular way of continuing that requires no force. To feel what the concept is reaching for, it helps to sit for a moment with what it was reaching against. A minister in a warring state's court, advising his king, lived inside a structure of relentless strategic calculation. Every alliance was an angle, every ceremony was a message, every gift was a claim. The effort required to navigate this world, the vigilance, the positioning, The exhausting labor of self-presentation was not experienced as optional. It was experienced as survival, which in practical terms it was. Into this world of total striving, the Tao Te Ching places the image of a sage who governs without governing, who acts without acting against the grain of anything, who is present in the way water is present, completely without effort, filling every available space and finding every available opening without once deciding to. The Tao that the text names and cannot define is the ground from which all this flows. Chapter after chapter circles it without arriving at a description, which the text treats not as a failure of language, but as an accurate response to what is being named. The Tao is not a god. It does not prefer, does not reward, does not punish, does not watch. It is closer to a process than a being, the ongoing self-generating movement of everything that is, without a designer and without a destination. The Chinese term that the tradition uses to describe how the Tao operates is Zai Ran, meaning self-so, naturally so, that which is as it is of its own nature, without external management. The seasons arrive through Zai Ran. The rivers find their courses through Zai Ran. The body breathes through Zai Ran. Nothing in the natural order applies for permission before continuing. Chapter 34 of the Tao Te Ching describes the Tao as accomplishing everything while claiming nothing. It gives life to the 10,000 things and makes no demand on them for gratitude. The sage who has understood this does not abandon action. The sage remains fully present in the world, continues to speak and advise and respond and engage. What changes is the quality of the engagement. The striving is gone from it. The ego that needed to be seen doing the right thing, the anxiety that kept calculating the distance between the current position and the desired outcome, these grow quiet, and in their quiet, the natural responsiveness of a fully present person, unobstructed by the noise of its own wanting, becomes available. This is what Ames means by ontological alignment rather than behavioral strategy. Wu Wei is not a technique to be applied from the outside of oneself to the situations one encounters. It is a description of what a person who has come into alignment with the Tao is already, naturally, unavoidably doing. The alignment is the prior thing. The effortless action follows from it, the way water follows from rain, not because it is trying to, but because the gradient is there, and water is what it is. The scholars who have held the Tao Te Ching in different centuries have not agreed on what it is saying about this alignment, and their disagreement is itself one of the more illuminating facts about the text. When Jesuit missionaries arrived in China in the 16th and 17th centuries and encountered the concept for the first time, many of them read it through the lens of Christian contemplative quietism, the tradition of mystical withdrawal from action in favor of passive openness to God. The stillness they found in Wu Wei felt familiar to them, and so they translated the concept in ways that emphasized withdrawal, cessation, the discipline of not doing. This reading was not without textual support. There are chapters of the Tao Te Ching that genuinely counsel something close to retreat, a preference for the small and simple over the grand and ambitious, an instruction to return to a kind of primal undifferentiation before the accumulated refinements of culture began to obscure the natural order. Arthur Waley, whose 1934 translation remains one of the most carefully considered in the Western scholarly tradition,
emphasized the political dimension of the text, Wu Wei, as the governing philosophy of a ruler who achieves stability precisely by not imposing too much, who holds the state together by releasing it from the pressure of constant interference. D.C.
La's 1963 Penguin translation opened the text to a wider readership with a more literal rendering, careful and restrained, preserving ambiguities that more interpretive translations had resolved. Stephen Mitchell's widely read version from 1988 moved further toward the lyrical, to rendering the text through a contemporary American sensibility that valued openness and spaciousness over historical precision, making the Tao Te Ching feel like something a person might discover in a moment of personal searching, rather than a document from a specific civilization in a specific crisis. Harold Roth, working later in the tradition of contextual scholarship, brought historical attention to the inner cultivation practices that likely surrounded the Tao Te Ching's composition, the Daoist meditative disciplines that seem to have been part of the intellectual world from which the text emerged, suggesting that Wu Wei is not only a political philosophy or a cosmological description, but also a condition cultivated through specific practices of quieting the mind and body. Ames, returning to the philosophical dimensions, but he insisted on the active dimension, the acting without acting against the grain, as the center of the concept, arguing that readings which collapse Wu Wei into mere passivity have misread the character Wei and lost the philosophy's most essential claim. None of these readers are wrong in a simple sense. All of them can point to passages. All of them can construct a coherent reading. The text remains unchanged, 81 brief chapters in which the same characters sit in the same sequence, refusing to settle into the single meaning any particular reader brings to them. This is not, the Daoist tradition would say, a defect of the text. It is the text performing what it is trying to describe. A text about water should move like water. A text about the space inside things should contain space. A text about the irreducibility of the Tao to any single formulation should resist single formulations in every direction, from quietist withdrawal to active spontaneous engagement, and hold all of them the way a river holds every shape of the ground it flows across, completely for the duration of contact, releasing each without grief. The world that produced this text, the long unraveling of Zhou authority, the constant military calculation of the warring states period, all of this sits in the deep background of the Tao Te Ching, the way a geological event sits in the background of a landscape. The mountains do not spend their time describing the forces that made them. The text does not dwell in the crisis that called it into being. Instead, it turns towards something older than the crisis, something that was operating before the dynasties began and would operate after the last one ended. The Tao itself, self-generating, self-regulating, requiring nothing, forgetting nothing, losing nothing. There is a chapter that says, "The soft and yielding overcomes the hard and rigid." Everyone knows this, and no one acts on it. The text does not explain why. It simply sets the observation down and leaves it there, available, beside everything else it sets down. All 81 chapters resting together on whatever surface holds them, an archivist's shelf, a scholar's desk, a translation in a library in a city the archivist could not have imagined, available to whoever comes to them and willing to sit with them quietly rather than demand that they speak clearly and at once. What Yin Shi, the gatekeeper, received when he asked the old man to write down what he knew was not a system. A system tells you what to do, and in what order and toward what outcome. What came back was something different, a series of images and observations and compressed formulations that keep opening rather than closing, that keep releasing rather than resolving, that seem to describe not a body of knowledge to be acquired, but a quality of attention to be with patience and without urgency inhabited. The road west from the Zhou capital passes through territory that grows quieter as the cities thin out and the land reasserts itself, dry and wide, and not especially interested in the drama of kingdoms. An old man on an ox moving through that landscape would have had time to think, or to stop thinking, or to discover the difference between those two things, which may be the discovery the 81 chapters are circling. The gatekeeper asked him to write it down. He wrote it down. Then he continued west, into country that left no record of his arrival, which is perhaps fitting for a philosophy that is least itself when it calls attention to itself. In the centuries that followed, the text traveled. It arrived in the hands of scholars who were trying to govern failing states, and in the hands of recluses who had given up on governance entirely. It arrived in the hands of young commentators who thought they had found the key to it, and in the hands of old scholars who had decided there was no key. It arrived in the hands of Buddhist monks who found in its description of the Tao something that sounded like the emptiness, their own tradition described by a different name, and in the hands of Confucian thinkers who wanted to argue with it about whether moral cultivation required effort, and concluded, with evidence on their side, that it did. The text did not change in any of these hands. The same characters, the same sequence, the same quality of remaining when the reader has put it down. The image that keeps returning across all these readings and all these centuries is not a grand one. It is a man in a room setting down a brush, not fleeing, not despairing, not performing a philosophical gesture for the benefit of anyone watching, simply completing something and preparing to leave, with a quality of unhurried completeness that is itself, before he has written a single word of the text that follows, an enactment of what the text is trying to describe. The records of the zoo court organized on their shelves, the brush at rest, the ink drying on whatever it last touched, the western gate waiting, with the open country beyond it. The question of what Wu Wei means, whether it is stillness or spontaneous action, withdrawal or presence, a technique of quiet governance or a description of cosmic alignment, a practical philosophy for a time of war or a description of something that has no relationship to time at all, is not a question that the tradition resolves. The early Jesuit missionaries held one answer. Arthur Waley held another. Harold Roth holds a third. Roger Ames holds a fourth. None of them have forced the others out, and the text continues to support all of them, which may mean the concept is rich enough to contain all these dimensions without being diminished by the fact that they do not agree, or it may mean something simpler, that a concept deep enough to describe the way the world holds itself together without effort is also deep enough to hold a few centuries of scholarly disagreement about itself without breaking. There is a kind of philosophical comfort in that thought, though the word comfort is perhaps too thin for it. It is more like a recognition, the sense that the thing being pointed at is wide enough to contain not only the certainty of those who think they have understood it, but the uncertainty of those who are not sure, and the question of those who have given up on certainty as the right goal, and the open wondering of those who find that the question itself, held without urgency, is livable in a way that confident answers have not always been. The text that came out of the Western Gate holds all of these the way water holds all the shapes it flows through, fully for as long as the contact lasts, and then releasing them into the continuing current without preference for any of them. Stillness and action, withdrawal and engagement, the sage who governs and the sage who disappears into the open country, the archivist who spent his life organizing what others had built, and the philosopher who said in 81 quiet chapters that striving itself is the problem, and that ceasing to strive against the grain of things is not defeat, but the beginning of something the striving had been covering over. The 81 chapters exist in this productive, unresolved space between all of these readings, as they have existed for more than 2,000 years, as they will exist in whatever hands next open them, offering not a conclusion, but a quality of attention, not an answer, but a particular way of resting inside the question, the way water rests inside whatever contains it, completely, without loss, taking the shape of the present moment and releasing it without grief when the shape changes, and flowing on, the brush set down in a small room in a fracturing dynasty, the characters pressed into silk or wood or whatever surface received them first, the gatekeeper at the Western Pass receiving 81 chapters of something that had no single name and needed none, and then the open country beyond the gate, wide and quiet and continuing in all directions, the way the Tao continues, without preference, without destination, without the anxious need to arrive. That is where the text comes from, a world under enormous pressure, finding somewhere at its edge a single archivist who set down his administrative duties and instead set down something that said, in the most compressed and open way language can manage, striving itself is the problem. The soft overcomes the hard. The empty hub carries the weight the spokes cannot. Water finds the lowest place and outlasts everything above it. The scholars in their different centuries have read this differently, and their readings stand beside each other, and the text stands beside all of them, unchanged, the way the open country stands beside all the roads that cross it, containing them, undiminished by them, continuing beyond every edge they reach. The question of what Wu Wei is can rest here for now, not answered, not dismissed, simply held with the same quality of unhurried attention that the concept itself is describing, the same spaciousness that the text offers to every reader who comes to it, willing to sit with what does not resolve, rather than reaching for what would. The old archivist walked west through a gate and into a country that has no record of where he stopped. The text he left behind did not follow him. It stayed, the way water stays in the vessel it has been given, waiting for whoever comes next, complete in itself, holding the tension between stillness and action, the way the night holds everything that rests within it, openly, without preference, without the need for anything to be otherwise. In his garden, or perhaps at his writing table, pushed close to the open door that looked onto the garden, Zhuangzi was writing about a knife, not about philosophy in the abstract, not about the nature of action or the problem of effortful striving. He was writing about a specific knife held by a specific man, moving through the body of an ox in a great hall where the sounds of the blade were, by his account, like the plucking of strings. The particularity of it seemed to matter to him. The cook's name, the ox's weight, the Lord watching from his seat, pleased and puzzled in equal measure. Zhuangzi was working, as he almost always worked, at the level of the image first, trusting that whatever philosophical truth he was feeling toward would arrive more honestly through the scene than through any argument built to contain it. His brush moved across the page in the early evening light. The story he was writing was this. Prince Hui's cook had been butchering oxen for 19 years with the same blade, and the blade had never needed sharpening, not because the blade was exceptional, because the cook had stopped, long ago, cutting through anything. He had learned, slowly, in the way that real learning happens, not through instruction, but through attention sustained over years, that the animal's body contained its own logic of spaces. Every joint had a natural gap. Every tendon had a plane along which it preferred to separate. The ox was not a solid thing requiring force to divide, but a structured thing whose structure, if understood, offered itself. The cook had not imposed an order on the animal. He had found the order already there and aligned himself with it. And once alignment replaced imposition, the blade never met resistance because it never asked the material to be other than it was. Zhuangzi wrote the cook's explanation slowly, in the voice of a man reporting something intimate. He wrote, "I glide through such great joints or cavities as there may be, according to the natural constitution of the animal." He paused over this sentence, put the brush down, looked at the garden. What he had written was not really about butchery. It was about the difference between two entirely different relationships to the world, one in which the person arrives at the situation carrying a prior idea of what they want from it, and one in which the person arrives empty, attentive, following, rather than forcing. The first relationship uses force, however disguised by refinement or ritual. The blade meets bone, the cook sharpens and sharpens. The second relationship finds the spaces between things and moves through them without friction, without leaving damage, arriving at the end of the work with a tool still whole and a task still done. This was the distinction Zhuangzi kept returning to throughout the long project of his writing, from different angles, through different stories, using humor and paradox and images that sometimes made his readers laugh before they had understood what they were laughing at. He insisted in his way of insisting, which was usually through stories rather than assertions, describing a technique. Techniques could be taught and practiced and still miss the essential thing entirely. The Confucian student could practice his ritual bow 10,000 times and still, on the 10,001st repetition, be performing it at a slight remove from himself, watching himself bow, monitoring his own grace, never quite arriving at the natural ease he was working so hard to manufacture. The cook could not have taught his 19-year skill in a single afternoon of instruction. What he had, after those years, was not a technique, but a quality, the quality of attention that had gradually dissolved the distinction between the cutter and the cutting, between the man who moved the blade and the blade moving through the available space. The Lord, watching from his seat, saw only the result. He called it skill. Cook Ding, speaking quietly to the people around him, said it was something else. He said what he was following was the Tao. The word sits in the sentence without being defined, the way the spaces between joints simply exist without needing explanation. Scholars who have spent their working lives with the Zhuangzi, Paul Kaelberg, Philip Ivanhoe, Edward Slingerland, have noted that Zhuangzi's method as a writer performs what he is trying to say at the level of philosophy itself. He does not argue for Wu Wei from a position of systematic doctrine. He enacts it in the structure of the discourse. The parables arrive without warning. The humor dissolves an argument before the reader has had time to defend against it. The self-undermining quality of some of his most important passages, in which the philosophical conclusion, once reached, tends to quietly dismantle the confidence with which it was reached, is not a flaw in the thinking, but the thinking's most careful achievement. Zhuangzi understood, earlier than most, that any direct instruction toward effortless spontaneity is already a kind of absurdity. The moment someone says, "Be natural, do not try, simply let things arise from your deepest nature," a new form of effort has already been introduced. A new way of watching the self has been handed to the reader, and so he wrote around the thing. He approached it sideways, through stories about cooks and carpenters and cicadas laughing at the ambition of birds who fly for months when they themselves have everything they need within a morning's range. He let the parables do what the arguments could not. He trusted the image to carry the load he knew the proposition would buckle under. This is why Edward Slingerland, in his careful philosophical reconstruction of the Zhuangzian tradition, reached for the language of psychology to describe what the Cook-Ding story is pointing toward, the states that later researchers would call expert intuition or flow, those intervals in which highly trained practitioners report the dissolution of the self-observer, the condition in which the athlete or the musician or the carpenter simply acts without the running commentary of the monitoring mind. The doing and the doer become temporarily identical, and the quality of the action tends to be, by several measures, better than anything deliberate effort alone can produce. Zhuangzi did not know the word flow. He did not need it. He had the cook's blade and the sound of strings. What made the image so useful? Why Zhuangzi returned to craft and skill throughout his writing, rather than to meditation or withdrawal, is that it keeps Wu Wei inside the world. The cook is in the Lord's hall. He is doing ordinary, necessary, physical work. He has not retreated from life in order to be free of the straining self. He has gone so deeply into one particular form of life, this animal, this knife, this particular way of listening to what the work asks, that the straining self has quietly receded, not because it was suppressed, but because it was no longer needed. The hall is noisy, the work is real, and through 19 years of patient, unself-conscious attention, something has been cultivated that is not quite skill and not quite wisdom, but partakes of both, and the blade slides on, unhurried, finding its way home through the spaces the animal's own structure has always provided. In the stillness of the garden behind him, something moved without being told to. Zhuangzi put the brush back to the page. He was also, around this time, or perhaps on a different evening, perhaps on a night when sleep had been slow in arriving, thinking about a tree, not just any tree, the great gnarled useless tree that appears in one of his parables, a tree so twisted and irregular that no carpenter would use it for timber, no cook would burn it for fuel, a tree that had survived to enormous age precisely because it had never been useful to anyone, where the straight-grained trees in the valley had been harvested decades earlier. This one stood alone, enormous, ancient, its uselessness having protected it from every axe. In the story, the tree speaks. It explains to the carpenter, who has dismissed it, that the carpenter's useful trees are cut down in their prime, while the tree itself has been able to grow old and vast and full only because no one has ever found a purpose for it. The useless tree, Zhuangzi was suggesting, knows something the useful trees do not. The particular virtue he was circling here was a quality he named Zairan, the Chinese compound, meaning most closely self-so or of itself so, the state of things that are fully and only what they are, without the addition of a performed identity or an imported purpose. A river is Zairan. It flows. It does not aspire to flow more efficiently. It does not consult the landscape it moves through. It simply follows the available gradient with an unself-consciousness so complete that the idea of improvement cannot get purchase on it. The great useless tree is Zairan. It grows the way it grows. It spreads its roots where they find purchase. It has not read the literature on optimal tree form and is not attempting to conform to any model of tree excellence. And here was Zhuangzi's wry, gentle argument against his Confucian contemporaries, against the entire architecture of self-improvement, ritual training, virtue cultivation that defined the dominant educational project of his age. The Confucian student was asked to become, through practice and discipline and the careful study of exemplars, a person of refined virtue. Every gesture, every expression of feeling, every social interaction was to be brought under the discipline of conscious cultivation. The goal was a kind of second nature, habits so refined they would eventually become effortless, a trained grace that looked natural. Zhuangzi watched this project with a kind of warm, philosophically serious laughter, not because the Confucians were foolish, he took them entirely seriously, but because he noticed something they seemed to have missed, that the effortlessness they were working toward could not be reached by the path they were walking. The very apparatus of self-monitoring and social performance that the training installed was the apparatus that natural spontaneity required dissolving. Every bow practiced for refinement was also a bow watched from inside by the bower, measured against an ideal, found adequate or wanting. And the harder the student worked at naturalness, the more self-conscious the naturalness became, until the virtue being cultivated was essentially a very polished form of performance. What a later French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre, would have recognized as a version of bad faith, the performance of authenticity rather than its actual possession. Zhuangzi put this in the mouth of a sage who meets a man practicing to be naturally gracious. The sage watches for a while, then he says quietly, "What you are working toward cannot be reached by working." The student asks what should be done instead. The sage has no direct answer. He tells another story. This is Zhuangzi's method. The refusal to instruct is not evasion, it is the point. Any instruction toward Wu Wei becomes its own obstacle. And the question of how to be effortlessly spontaneous is the question that cannot be answered directly without undercutting itself. And so the only honest response is the oblique one, the story, the image, the parable that the reader has to sit with, that works on the reader the way the tree grows, slowly, without forcing, the roots finding their way downward, through the dark without being told where the water is. There is a quality in Zhuangzi's humor that is worth sitting with for a moment in the quiet of this evening. His humor is not the humor of intellectual superiority. He does not laugh at his opponents or at the people who have not yet understood. He laughs at the situation, at the comedy inherent in watching a creature with a self try to get rid of the self, at the spectacle of a mind trying to achieve no mind through determined mental effort, at the ancient and inescapable irony that the desire to be free of desire is still a desire, and a fairly energetic one. There is a deep kindness in this laughter. It is the laughter of someone who has noticed that the trap everyone is caught in is the same trap he himself was caught in before he found the opening, and who cannot describe the opening directly, but hopes that the description of the trap might help someone feel it from the inside, and feeling it, relax the grip just enough. When Zhuangzi was old, according to his students, he asked to be buried without ceremony. His disciples objected, worried that his body would be left to the birds. He said, "Above ground, I am food for birds. Below ground, I am food for worms. Why favor the worms?" This is the same laughter. The self that clings to preference about what happens to its remains is still the self that has confused the container with the content, still the self that Zhuangzi spent his whole philosophical life trying to help people hold more lightly, more provisionally, more like a set of clothes than like a cage. The butterfly dream arrives at the end of the second chapter of his book. It arrives almost as an afterthought, or as the kind of conclusion that does not announce itself as a conclusion. He has been writing through the whole of that long chapter about the perspective from which all distinctions dissolve, right and wrong, this and that, self and other, arguing in his indirect way that these distinctions are real and useful within a limited perspective and unreal from a wider one, the way the mushroom that lives for a single morning cannot know the alternation of spring and autumn because its entire life fits inside a single season, and the mushroom is not wrong, it is simply situated, and all creatures are situated. And the sage is the one who has found a way to hold the situatedness lightly, to move fluidly between scales. And then he writes, "Once upon a time, I Zhuangzi dreamed I was a butterfly, fluttering here and there. I was conscious only of following my butterfly fancies, completely unaware of being Zhuangzi. Then I awoke, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man, dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly, dreaming I am a man." He sets this down, simply, without editorial. He adds one more sentence: between a man and a butterfly, there is necessarily a barrier, and that is all. The chapter ends. Scholars have been sitting with this passage for more than 2,000 years, and the sitting has not exhausted it. That is one of the things the passage is about. What is worth resting inside is the texture of the experience Zhuangzi is describing, not the metaphysical question of which side of the dream is the real one, but the quality of waking that he is pointing toward, the moment before full waking, the brief interval in which both identities feel equally provisional, equally plausible, before the habits of ordinary life reassemble themselves and the usual self clicks back into place with its usual weight. In that interval, something is visible that ordinary waking consciousness tends to close over. The boundaries of self that feel, in the middle of a busy afternoon, as solid and necessary as walls, seem, in that threshold moment, more like patterns, more like tendencies. The way a particular eddy in a river has a shape that persists for a while before the current shifts, and the eddy gently dissolves, and the water that composed it joins the rest of the water without resistance. Zhuangzi had noticed this interval, and he was inviting his reader to notice it. The philosophy that underlies the butterfly dream is not primarily skeptical. It is not primarily arguing that ordinary experience is an illusion or that the self is definitely not real. The argument is softer than that, more generous, more interested in what happens in people's lived experience when they relax the grip of a fixed identity than in any theoretical claim about metaphysics. What Zhuangzi was pointing toward was something like this: the bounded, continuous, clearly defined self that the Confucian curriculum was trying to perfect and refine is not quite as solid as the curriculum assumes. It is a construction that has enormous practical value and should not be carelessly discarded, but the fact of its constructedness means that it is not the only possible organization of experience, and there are intervals, dreaming, waking, deep absorption and skilled work, the silence before a reply, in which the construction loosens, and in those intervals, something moves with more ease, with less friction, with the quality that Zhuangzi had been trying to describe from the beginning. Wu Wei, in the Zhuangzian telling, is the natural mode of a being who has woken up to its own fluidity. Not a technique added to an unchanged self, not a discipline imposed from outside, something closer to what remains when the unnecessary additions have been allowed to fall away, the way a river, when the dam breaks, does not have to learn to flow. It was already flowing. The obstacle is removed, and the flowing is simply allowed to continue in its own direction, at its own pace, with the particular character that the shape of the land has always been drawing out of it. A tree growing in a garden, at night, growing without consulting any principle of growth, its branches extending toward available light through no deliberation, no committee of branches agreeing on a direction, no consultation with the literature on optimal photosynthetic positioning, its roots moving downward and outward through the soil, finding the damp places, finding the passages between stones, following moisture through no process that any diagram could fully map, the whole organism proceeding through the dark hours in a state of complete, unhurried engagement with the world it is embedded in and acting through its own growth, something that 1,000 pages of philosophy can describe, approach from every angle, illuminate from multiple traditions, and still only gesture toward, which is the quality of action that costs nothing, that does not accumulate fatigue, that leaves the blade unblunted and the tree enormous, and the cook standing quietly in the hall after 19 years, with his blade still whole, listening to what the Lord is asking him, trying to find the words, finding the spaces between. There is something in Zhuangzi's way of arguing, his philosopher's laugh, his indirection, his preference for the image over the assertion, that points toward a quality he himself was trying to demonstrate in the act of writing. His book is not a systematic treatise. It does not proceed from premises to conclusions. It circles, returns, changes registers without warning, puts wisdom in the mouths of cooks and cicadas and ancient trees, undercuts its own propositions at the moment they become most confident, and does all of this not because Zhuangzi was a careless thinker, but because he was a very careful one who understood that the kind of philosophical truth he was reaching for could not be caged inside a system without ceasing to be itself. The Tao that can be named, as his predecessor had written, is not the eternal Tao. Zhuangzi took this seriously at the level of method as well as content. Hubdria's writing is itself a kind of wu-wei, a thinking that moves through its material the way the cook's blade moves through the ox, finding the natural joints and spaces, not forcing conclusions, not insisting on the order it has arrived with, discovering the shape of the argument through the act of moving through it rather than planning it in advance. The reader who finishes his book does not come away with a system. They come away with something more like an altered quality of attention, a way of noticing the spaces in things, a slight relaxation in the grip with which they hold their own identity as the final word on who they are. This altered quality cannot be taught directly. It can only be pointed at. Through stories, through images, through a philosopher laughing at the end of an argument, not laughing because someone has been defeated, not laughing because he has won, but laughing with the genuine delight of having dissolved the terms of a dispute entirely, leaving only the open air where the debate had been, and the two people who were arguing now standing together in that openness which is roomier and quieter than either of them expected. Outside the garden, the evening deepens. Halsey, Kirby combs the paper, the brush resting at its edge. These are the instruments of a man who has spent his philosophical life looking for the spaces between things, and has on his better evenings found them. Cook Ding, somewhere in the pages drying beside him, lifts his blade after the work is done and stands a moment before the opened animal, composing himself, letting the exhilaration of perfect execution pass through him like a wave and out the other side until the stillness returns and the skill returns into its resting condition, waiting for the next occasion to move without effort through what is already there. What remains after the argument is not a conclusion, but an opening. Zhuangzi is a butterfly. The butterfly is Zhuangzi. The threshold between one and the other is real and necessary, and also in those intervals that arrive between dreaming and full waking, briefly visible as the lighter, more provisional boundary that it is. And this is not frightening. It does not call for alarm or immediate philosophical remedy. It is simply spacious. The self that had been solid for a moment feels like a river, still recognizably itself, still moving in its direction, still carrying what it carries, but capable of moving around and through the shapes that arise in its path, capable of finding the lowest ground, capable of holding whatever touches it for as long as touching lasts and releasing it after, the way water holds a stone's reflection and then, when the stone is lifted away, simply holds the next thing and the next, without preference, without the effort of either grasping or refusing. This is the threshold Zhuangzi has been leading his reader toward, through all the stories, through all the philosophers laughing at the end of dissolved arguments, through all the useless trees and ageless cooks and cicadas who cannot imagine the 9 months' journey of the great bird, because their whole world fits inside a single morning. The boundary between one thing and another is real and necessary, and in the stillness before full waking, remarkably, quietly light. The question of which side of it is the dream can rest there, inside its own openness, held the way a still pool holds the sky, not grasping it, not releasing it, simply receiving it in the particular hour before the wind arrives, when the surface of everything has gone perfectly, temporarily, till Mencius was standing in a garden in the state of Qi, pointing toward a row of seedlings in the ground. The plants were small enough that the soil still showed between them, and the green of the new shoots was the particular pale green of things that have only recently decided to exist. His students were gathered around him, some crouching to look more closely at the plants, some standing back and watching him speak. The lesson he was giving that afternoon was not about agriculture. It was about the nature of the human heart, and the garden was simply the closest available image for what he believed the heart already contained and what it required in order to grow. The seedlings, he said, were not yet what they would become, but the becoming was already there, folded into what they were. Something in each plant was already reaching, already oriented toward what it needed, already in the slow process of unfolding into its own form. Then to what is already reaching, he told his students, clear the ground around it. Give it what it needs to extend in the direction it is already growing. This is not creating virtue from nothing. It is recognizing what was always there and allowing it to complete itself. This was Mencius's argument against a very different kind of thinking, the kind that said the moral life was not a garden to be tended, but a river to be released. And the distance between those two images, the tended garden and the released river, was not a small philosophical nicety. Instead, it was the distance between two entirely different accounts of what a human being is and what the right relationship to one's own nature might be. Somewhere to the south and east of that garden in Qi, in the generations of thought that preceded and surrounded Mencius, another position had taken shape. It said that the seedlings did not need tending. It said, more exactly, that the gardener's hands, however well-intentioned, were more likely to interfere with what was naturally unfolding than to assist it. There is an old story, told in a Confucian text as a cautionary tale, of a farmer so anxious for his crops to grow that he went out at night and pulled each seedling upward by a small amount, convinced that this would accelerate their development. In the morning, the plants were dead. The story was meant as mockery, but the Daoist tradition found in it a kind of emblem. Too much helping, applied to what is already doing what it needs to do, is not help at all. It is damage performed with good intentions. This was not an argument Mencius could accept. The moral sprouts he pointed to in the garden required cultivation. Left entirely alone, they might wither. The conditions for their development were not automatically present, simply because the initial orientation was a child who had never been taught what justice looks like in practice, who had never been formed by the gradual repetition of ritual gesture and social obligation, might have the seed of virtue, but would never find its full form. The process of becoming genuinely good was, for Mencius, irreducibly effortful, not forced, not violent, but active, engaged, sustained, over years. What the Taoist tradition called the disease, Mencius called the medicine. In this disagreement, quiet, persistent, conducted across generations rather than across a table, is one of the oldest and most patient arguments in Chinese philosophical history. It did not reach a resolution. It did not need to. The two positions simply continued, each illuminating the other by contrast, like two different kinds of light falling on the same landscape from different angles and revealing different things. Wang Bi was barely 20 years old when he sat down with the text of the Tao Te Ching in the court of the Wei Kingdom and began writing what would become the most influential commentary the text had ever received. The Wei Kingdom itself was under considerable strain. The great Han dynasty had collapsed, and the period that followed, the Three Kingdoms era, was characterized by political instability, sharp enough that a young scholar with philosophical ambitions could observe, from his position close to the center of power, exactly what happened when rulers grabbed too tightly at control. Wang Bi was not a Taoist recluse. He was a court intellectual, moving in the circles where policy was made and influence was accumulated. He had every reason to understand the machinery of power from the inside. What he found in Laozi's compressed elliptical chapters was not a philosophy of withdrawal. He found something that looked to his particular set of eyes like the most sophisticated account of governance that had ever been written. The sage in Wang Bi's reading does not disappear. The sage rules, but what the sage has emptied from the ruling is the self-interested calculation, the anxious monitoring of outcomes, the compulsive need to be seen to be governing. What remains after that emptying is something Wang Bi called the embodiment of nothingness, a way of inhabiting a position of power without filling it with the ego that typically occupies such positions, and in occupying them, distorts every decision they make. This was not quietism. Wang Bi was not recommending that rulers retire to mountain hermitages and leave their kingdoms to manage themselves. He was recommending a quality of attention, a particular relationship to one's own decision-making, in which the absence of self-serving calculation made the governance more effective, rather than less. The empty center of the wheel, he might have said, is not a failure of the wheel. It is what makes the wheel work. His commentary on the Tao Te Ching was so thorough and so carefully argued that it became, for centuries, the lens through which educated Chinese readers encountered Laozi's original text. Which means that an enormous portion of the tradition's engagement with Wu Wei was mediated through a young man's reading from a politically turbulent court, a reading that found in the concept of non-action not a withdrawal from the world, but a particular and disciplined form of presence within it. There is something appropriate in this. The concept had always been able to hold more than one kind of reader. In a torchlit corridor somewhere in the state of Han, perhaps a generation before Wang Bi was born, a very different reader had found a very different thing in the same concept. The political theorist Han Fei was making a case to a minister, or imagining such a case, or writing about the logic of such a case. The exact context is less important than the argument, which was precise and cold and entirely practical. A ruler who wants to maintain absolute power must maintain absolute opacity. He must reveal nothing of his own desires, preferences, or plans, because the moment his subordinates know what he wants, they will perform wanting it for him, and the performance will substitute for the reality, and he will be governing appearances rather than the actual state of affairs. The ruler's stillness, in Han Fei's formulation, is a weapon. The ruler's Wu Wei is a mask, the same word, worn in such different ways. This was not a misreading, exactly. There is something in the concept that genuinely lends itself to this use. The idea that non-disclosure creates a kind of negative space that others cannot strategically fill, that the person who withholds their intentions retains an advantage that the person who expresses them immediately surrenders. Han Fei took this observation and pressed it into service for a theory of autocratic control. He kept the vocabulary, he discarded the cosmology. What remained was Wu Wei as technique, stripped of its alignment with the Tao, its grounding in Ziran, its sense of a self emptied of ego rather than a self concealed behind calculation. This transformation raises a question that does not have a clean answer. What makes a concept vulnerable to being used in ways that contradict its origin? And is the vulnerability a flaw in the concept, or simply a demonstration of how easily any idea can be carried into contexts its originators could not have anticipated and would not have recognized? The Daoist tradition did not answer this question directly. It continued. Across several centuries, and a great change in the intellectual atmosphere of China, a new set of thinkers arrived, carrying a different set of texts. Buddhist missionaries had been moving along the trade routes into China since roughly the 1st century of the Common Era, and what they carried with them was a philosophy that had, in its Mahayana form, developed an extraordinarily elaborate and precise account of emptiness, sunyata, as the fundamental nature of all phenomena. Everything that appears to be a stable, independent entity is in fact a temporary pattern in a flow of interdependent arising. Nothing has a fixed essence. Even the self that seems to be experiencing all of this is itself an empty construction, a convenient fiction told by a stream of events that contains no stable teller. The Chinese scholars who encountered these teachings found themselves in a position that is both intellectually rare and philosophically productive, looking at ideas that were genuinely foreign in their technical development, and yet seemed to rhyme, in some deep structural way, with ideas they had already been living with. The Daoist Tao, that which cannot be named, that operates without preference, that is the source of all things, and yet itself no thing, bore a certain family resemblance to the Buddhist account of ultimate reality as beyond all fixed characterization. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, acting without acting against the nature of things, moving in alignment with what is already moving, seemed to touch at certain angles the Buddhist understanding of wisdom as the capacity to act without grasping, without resistance, without the distortion introduced by the ego's anxious need to manage outcomes. This process of finding contact between the two traditions, of matching concepts from one philosophical vocabulary to concepts in another, is given a name in Chinese intellectual history, Gei Huid, which means something like concept matching or finding the analog. It was not a precise process. The resemblances were real but incomplete. Sunyata and the Tao are not the same concept. Wu Wei and the Buddhist understanding of wise action do not coincide at every point. But the matching was productive. Precisely because it was imprecise, it generated new questions, forced both traditions to become more articulate about what exactly they were claiming, and created a space in which a genuinely new form of philosophical and contemplative practice could eventually emerge. What emerged over several centuries of this kind of encounter was the Chan tradition, known in Japan as Zen, which brought together the Mahayana analysis of mind and emptiness with the Taoist aesthetic of naturalness, spontaneity, and the insufficiency of deliberate conceptual effort. Chan did not simply combine two existing systems. It found a particular angle of view from which both pointed towards something that could not be fully expressed in either language alone. The Chan understanding of Wu Nain, no thought, or thought without fixed object, and Wu Xin, no mind, or the mind operating without the ego's interference, were not translations of Wu Wei, but they belonged to the same extended family of concerns. Each was, in its way, a description of what it looks like to act from the deepest available register of the self, before the layer of self-conscious calculation interposes itself between the arising impulse and the response. Each was trying to articulate what it means for a human being to be genuinely present to what is happening, rather than absorbed in the running commentary about what is happening. Each was asking whether there is a way of moving through the world that does not add unnecessary friction to the already sufficient complexity of being alive. A Buddhist monk in the Tang dynasty sits before a text written by a Daoist scholar, and what he feels, before any active interpretation, before any careful analysis of how the vocabularies differ and the traditions diverge, is a kind of recognition, not the recognition of the identical, but the recognition of a kinship across difference. The way a person who has spent years learning a particular kind of music might feel, hearing for the first time a very different kind of music from a very different place, a recognizing not of the same melody, but of the same kind of listening the music requires. These encounters between traditions change both sides of the meeting. The Taoist tradition that absorbed Buddhist influences became more attentive to the detailed phenomenology of the contemplative mind, more interested in describing the texture of inner experience, more equipped with practices for cultivating the conditions from which Wu Wei might naturally arise. The Buddhist tradition that developed in Chinese soil carried within it a freshness about the natural world, a lightness about doctrine, a willingness to find the expression of deep wisdom in ordinary unhurried gesture, in the preparation of tea, in the working of a field, in the movement of water, that it might not have found in the same form without the Taoist ground it grew in. The concept of Jing, stillness, or quietude, appears in the Tao Te Ching's 16th chapter as a kind of cosmological fact and a practical orientation at once. The 10,000 things arise, Laozi says, and each returns to its root. This returning is stillness, and stillness is the natural movement of all things, the direction toward which everything is already tending, the deepest current beneath all the surface turbulence of arising and passing away. To become still is not to resist the world. It is to move with the deepest thing in the world, the pull toward the root that all things share, and that no amount of striving can either create or prevent. This is Jing not as the absence of movement, but as the presence of something the movement has been obscuring. The way that a river, even at its most turbulent on the surface, has still water at its deepest point, a stillness that the rapids do not disturb and the eddies do not reach, and the fallen branches sweeping past in the current do not trouble. The Taoist meditation traditions, particularly those associated with what would later be called the Naidan school, the tradition of internal alchemy, concerned not with transforming metals, but with the transformation of the inner constitution of the practitioner, took Jing as their central practical concern. To sit in stillness was not a retreat from the philosophy. It was the philosophy enacted in the body, the breath settling, the interior commentary gradually, over time and practice, growing quieter, the awareness that remained after the commentary had fallen below its usual volume, present, open, not grabbing at any of the things arising within it, not refusing any of them either. This was the quality the traditions were cultivating, not a special state, not an achievement. something more like the uncovering of what had always been underneath the noise. Wang Yangming, writing in the early 16th century, was not a Taoist. He was a Neo-Confucian, a scholar working squarely within the tradition that Mencius had helped to establish, committed to the view that moral cultivation was real work that required real effort, sustained across a real lifetime. And yet he was troubled by something in the dominant Neo-Confucian account of that effort, the version articulated by Zhu Xi in the 12th century, which emphasized the careful external investigation of moral principles as the path toward genuine virtue. Wang Yangming had tried to live by this method and found that it produced in his own experience not the integrated moral clarity it promised, but a kind of anxious, effortful striving that felt from the inside less like approaching virtue than like trying to become something he was not. He eventually arrived at a different account. The moral knowledge he had been seeking externally was already present within the mind. He came to believe what he called liongji, innate moral knowledge, the capacity to know immediately and directly what the right action is in any situation. This knowing was not the product of deliberate study and effortful cultivation. It was already there. The cultivation consisted, in Wang Yangming's account, not in adding something new, but in removing the layers of habitual distortion and self-interested calculation that covered over what was already present. The right action, when the covering has been removed, arises spontaneously. It does not need to be calculated. It does not need to be performed. It simply moves. This is not Wu Wei. Wang Yangming's account of innate moral knowledge carries within it a confidence about the specific content of moral reality, about what the right action actually is, that the Taoist tradition deliberately withholds, and yet the resemblance in structure is real, and the scholars who work between these traditions have noted it for generations. The tension between Mencius's position and Zhuangzi's position, between the tended garden and the released river, does not resolve in Wang Yangming, but it finds in him a moment of partial and honest contact, a Confucian thinker acknowledging that the striving at the heart of his own tradition might, at a certain point, become its own obstacle. The partial resolution does not hold. It was never meant to. Each generation that inherits these questions inherits them intact, with the same edges and the same unresolved center, and must find its own way of living with them. A pond in the hour before dawn carries the last few stars on its surface. The water is completely still, not the stillness of something stopped, not the stillness of something waiting to begin, but the stillness of something that has arrived at the bottom of its own nature and found it sufficient. The reeds at the edge do not move. The air does not move. Whatever birds are in the trees around the pond are not yet stirring. The surface of the water holds the reflected sky without comment, without preference, without any disposition to hold one kind of sky more carefully than another. Whatever appears above it is held. Whatever stops appearing is released. The holding and the releasing are the same gesture, performed so continuously and so effortlessly that the pond has no experience of doing either. This is Jing not described, but demonstrated. The pond has no teaching to offer. It simply is what stillness is, and in being it, it shows something that any amount of instruction can only approximate. The arguments between Mencius and the Taoist tradition, between Wang Bi's governance through emptiness and Han Fei's governance through strategic concealment, between the Gai scholars trying to match Buddhist and Taoist concepts, and the Chan masters who found both traditions pointing beyond all concept, between Wang Yangming's innate moral knowledge and the Taoist river that does not know it is flowing toward the sea. All of these arguments are carried in words that refer, however obliquely, to something that exists before words, to something the pond demonstrates, to something that the 16th chapter of the Tao Te Ching gestures toward when it says, return to the root, and this is called stillness, and stillness is called the return to one's destiny. The arguments did not destroy the thing they were arguing about. This is worth noting, though not as a comfort exactly, simply as a fact about the nature of certain philosophical concepts. They can survive being misused. They can survive being translated inadequately. They can survive being borrowed by traditions that transform them almost beyond recognition. What remains after all the translations and transformations is not precisely what existed before them, but neither is it nothing. Something persists through the handling. Something in the concept continues to point toward the same quality of experience, the same orientation of a life, the same relationship between a human being and the deepest available current of what is. The Han Feizi advisor, leaning close to the minister in the torchlit corridor, was using Wu Wei as armor, a protective concealment, a method of managing power by withholding the information others would need to outmaneuver him. He was using the word correctly and the concept incorrectly, if such a distinction makes sense, which the Daoist tradition would likely say it does. The word can be detached from its roots. The concept cannot quite be followed to its conclusion without arriving back at its roots, because at its conclusion, the strategic concealment breaks down. The ruler who conceals his desires has not emptied himself of desire. He has only hidden it. The hidden desire continues to organize everything he does, continues to be the secret agenda that all his governance serves. The stillness is performed, the emptiness is fake, and fake emptiness is not a stage on the way to real emptiness, it is a wall against it. The real thing, in every tradition that has tried to describe it, does not serve any agenda. It is not a means to anything. It is not strategic, not calculated, not designed to produce specific outcomes in specific situations, however beneficial those outcomes might be. It is simply the condition of a mind that has stopped adding unnecessary friction to the already sufficient complexity of what is. From that condition, certain things tend to arise. Good governance, in Wang Yangming's account. Spontaneous moral clarity, in Wang Yangming's account. The kind of action that does not leave tracks, in Zhuangzi's account. The blade that glides without effort through the spaces already present, in the parable that the tradition has returned to again and again, without exhausting what it contains. But the arising cannot be aimed at. The moment one begins trying to achieve the condition of Wu Wei, one has already moved away from it. This is not a paradox designed to frustrate. It is simply a description of the particular territory this concept occupies, territory that is genuinely different from the territory occupied by skills one can practice until one has them, habits one can form through repetition, character traits one can cultivate through sustained effort. Not because Hua Wei is impossible, because it is already present underneath the effort, and the effort is precisely what is covering it. Mencius's garden and the Daoist river were not, in the end, describing different destinations. They were describing different relationships to what was already true. The Confucian tradition trusted that sustained, careful attention to the conditions of growth would eventually produce a person capable of genuine virtue. The Daoist tradition trusted that the genuine virtue was already there, and that the cultivation could become its own obstacle if it forgot what it was cultivating toward. Neither position was wrong about what it saw clearly. Neither position saw clearly what the other saw. This is perhaps the deepest thing the argument between these traditions has to offer, not a resolution, but a demonstration of the difficulty of the thing being discussed. Something that is already present cannot be achieved. Something that cannot be achieved must still, in some sense, be approached. The approach that knows it is an approach that carries in it the awareness of striving toward the thing may be the most honest approach available, and the wisdom of knowing when to put the approach down, when to stop adding effort to what only effort ceasing will reveal, is itself a form of the understanding both traditions are trying to describe. The Buddhist monk in the Tang dynasty who looked at the Daoist text and felt recognition was not confused about the differences between the two systems. He knew the differences. He had studied both carefully enough to be precise about what separated them, but he had also, somewhere in his practice, encountered a quality of experience that both systems were pointing at, a quality that existed before either system had named it and would exist after both had been forgotten. And in that quality, the family resemblance made itself felt more strongly than any distinction of vocabulary or doctrine could resist. Whatever that quality is, it does not belong to any single tradition. It is the thing that every tradition that has tried to describe it has described imperfectly and yet not uselessly. The imperfection of each description is not a failure. It is a demonstration that the thing being described is alive, alive enough to exceed any container, to keep spilling over the edges of every formulation, to remain, after all the centuries of careful articulation, still slightly more than any of the words. Jing persists through all of it. The stillness at the bottom of the river that the arguments and the schools and the centuries of commentary and the borrowed vocabularies and the political appropriations have not reached and cannot reach, not because it is protected, because it is the ground from which everything, including all the striving and all the contention, keeps arising and returning. The Taoist meditating alone in a mountain hermitage is returning to it. The Chan monk sitting in the monastery hall before dawn is returning to it. The Neo-Confucian scholar who settles the mind before beginning to write, who recognizes in that settling something that no system quite accounts for, is returning to it. The paths by which they approach it are genuinely different. The stillness they find when the approach is complete is not a pond. In the hour before dawn, holds the last stars on its surface, and then the stars begin to dim, and then the light comes from the east, slow and unhurried, and the pond holds that too. It does not prefer the stars to the light, or the dark to the dawn. It holds whatever comes. It releases whatever goes. The quarrel about how to reach the stillness has been going on for 2,500 years, and the stillness itself has not moved. It does not need to. Everything that comes toward it arrives there eventually, and everything that arrives finds the same thing, not a conclusion, not an answer, not the last word in a very old argument, but simply what was always here, waiting without impatience, open without requirement, still in the way that still things are still, when nothing is pressing them to be otherwise. Somewhere near the edge of a wide river, in the hour after the last light has left the water, but before the stars have gathered enough to cast shadows, a man sits close enough to hear the current moving around the stones in the riverbed. The sound is not dramatic. It is the ordinary sound of water, doing what water has always done, finding the lowest available path, parting around obstacles without friction, joining itself back together on the other side as though nothing had interrupted it. The man listening is old enough to have stopped trying to describe this sound accurately, and wise enough to know that the attempt to describe it was never the point. What he hears is not a metaphor, it is the thing itself, already demonstrating what no argument about it can fully reach. The chapters that deal with water in the Tao Te Ching did not arrive as theory, They arrived as observation. Laozi, or the figure given that name by centuries of tradition, returned again and again to water, not because water illustrated an idea he already held, but because water was showing something that could not be shown any other way. Nothing in the observable world is softer. A hand pressed into a stream meets no resistance worth naming, and yet the stream, given enough time, leaves its record in stone. The canyon walls that rise above a river are not the river's achievement in any ordinary sense. The river did not intend them. It simply went where it could go, without forcing, without choosing, following the available gradient with a patience that has no beginning and requires no end. The result is a kind of power that force alone cannot produce. On the Tao Te Ching returns to this image the way the river itself returns to certain stones, not because the thought is new, but because the thing it points toward cannot be fixed in place and must be approached again from a slightly different angle each time. Chapter 78 of the Tao Te Ching states the principle plainly. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, and yet nothing overcomes the hard and rigid more surely. Laozi sets the observation down without elaboration, the way water settles without ceremony into the lowest available hollow. The statement is not offered as a paradox to be solved. It is offered as something anyone who has ever watched water long enough already knows, a recognition rather than an argument, and recognition of a different quality than argument, because it does not require the reader to be persuaded, but only to have paid a certain kind of attention. The philosophy already living inside the observation does not announce itself. It waits for the attention that will find it, the way the river waits in the canyon without impatience for the traveler who will eventually stand at the rim and look down. What the water chapters of the Tao Te Ching are pointing toward is a quality in the structure of things that is not limited to water. Water is the most visible instance of a pattern that runs through everything the Tao gives rise to, which is everything. The Tao Te Ching describes the 10,000 things, all the variety of the observable world, as arising from the Tao and returning to it, and the phrase that accompanies this description is Ziran, which carries in its original characters the meaning of self-so, or of itself so, not caused by anything external, not aimed at anything external. The 10,000 things arise because it is their nature to arise, move in the patterns they move in, because that is what they are, and return when the season of their arising has run through. There is no manager overseeing this process, no agency separate from the process itself, directing it toward an outcome. The Tao does not decide to make a river. The river is what happens when the Tao's inexhaustible capacity for self-organization meets the particular conditions of a mountain and gravity and rain. The philosopher and writer Alan Watts, working in the middle decades of the 20th century, found a phrase for what he noticed when he looked carefully at the relationship between human striving and the self-organizing intelligence of the natural world. He called it the backwards law. The observation behind the phrase is not complicated, though it is persistently difficult to act on. The harder a person tries to sleep, the more the sleep retreats. The more urgently someone reaches for a feeling of calm, the further the calm recedes. The more carefully a student monitors whether the piano piece is going well, the more the playing tightens and the mistakes multiply. In systems that have their own natural rhythm, and the Tao Te Ching suggests that all systems have their own natural rhythm, the compulsion to improve, control, and fix is not only unnecessary, but actively counterproductive. The interference creates its own disruption. The striving is the obstacle. Watts arrived at this observation from his engagement with both Taoist and Zen Buddhist texts, and while the precise framing was his own, the recognition it points toward is ancient. And the Tao had been demonstrating the backwards law since before there was a name for it, in every river that does more lasting work by yielding than any forced excavation could achieve. What makes this difficult to simply accept and enact is that the backwards law feels, from the inside, like an invitation to stop caring. The mind trained to associate effort with achievement hears the suggestion that striving is the obstacle and reads it as permission for collapse, for indifference, for the abandonment of any aspiration toward the better. This is not what the Tao Te Ching is describing, and the distinction matters. A river moving through a canyon is not indifferent. It is, in some sense, that requires careful holding, the opposite of indifferent. It responds to every variation in the terrain with total precision, adjusting its course around each particular stone with an accuracy that no deliberate navigation could match. What the river lacks is not attentiveness, but the compulsion to have the path be other than what it is. The river does not argue with the stone. It finds the available space beside the stone and moves through it, and in moving through it, the stone is changed. The striving is not against the self-organizing intelligence of the system. The striving is only against the ego's demand that the path look different from the one that is available. The 11th chapter of the Tao Te Ching extends this observation into the domain of form itself. 30 spokes meet at the hub of a wheel, Laozi writes, and it is the hole at the center, the empty space, the absence, that makes the wheel useful. A clay vessel is shaped by the potter's hands, but what the vessel holds is the hollow that the clay surrounds. A room is useful because of the space inside the walls, not because of the walls themselves. The argument is not that absence is better than presence, or that emptiness outranks form. It is more careful than that. The usefulness of the whole depends on the void at its center. The spokes are necessary, but they cannot do what the emptiness does. The walls are necessary, but the room is the space they enclose. Remove the hollow from the wheel, and what remains is not a wheel, but a solid disk that cannot turn. The apparent nothing at the center is doing work that the solid something around it cannot do and cannot even approach. This is the image the Tao Te Ching keeps returning to when it speaks of Wu Wei. Non-action is not the absence of a wheel's spoke. It is the absence at the center that the spokes make possible. Without the activity of all the other elements, the clay the potter's hands have shaped, the wood the craftsman has cut and fitted, the fire that has hardened the vessel, the emptiness would have no form to give it function. Wu Wei is not the rejection of all action, but the holding open of the space from which genuinely responsive action can arise. When that space is filled in with planning, with anxious monitoring, with the ego's insistence on controlling the outcome, the wheel becomes a solid thing that cannot turn, and the room becomes a wall that cannot shelter anyone. There is a concept in Daoist philosophy that names the condition the Tao Te Ching is pointing toward in these chapters. Pure, the character carries the image of unhewn wood, wood that has not yet met the chisel, rough, unfinished in the way that contains within it all possible finished forms. A block of wood resting in a carpenter's workshop at evening, after the tools have been set aside, holds inside its grain every chair and bowl and beam it could become. None of those possibilities has been foreclosed. The craftsman's work tomorrow will open one of them, and in opening one will close the rest. The wood in its unhewn state is not inferior to the finished object. It is prior to it, and prior in a way that carries something the finished object cannot. Every possible form is still possible. The poo of the wood is its original completeness, before the discriminating intelligence of the craftsman has selected and excluded and shaped. Laozi invokes poo as the sage's ideal condition, not because the sage refuses to act or remains forever unfinished, but because the sage returns to this quality of original completeness between the moments when action is genuinely called for, the way the carpenter sets the tools down and lets the workshop rest when the day's work is done. The sage who embodies pooing does not carry the last project into the next one, does not arrive at each new situation already committed to a particular outcome, does not bring the chisel to the wood before noticing which way the grain runs. The uncarved block is not an image of passivity. It is an image of openness, the radical receptivity of a mind that has not yet foreclosed its possible responses. To hold the image of poo alongside the image of the water finding its way through stone is to notice something that the Tao Te Ching does not argue for directly, but demonstrates throughout its 81 chapters, that the most enduring and effective forms of action arise from the condition that resembles not acting. The river that cuts the canyon does not push. The unhewn wood that becomes a fine vessel is the wood that was allowed to be wood before it was asked to be anything else. The sage who governs through Wo Wei does not impose an order on events, but moves with the order that events already contain, the way water moves with the gradient of the terrain rather than against it. In each case, the action that achieves the most comes from the disposition that holds loosely, responds precisely, and does not insist on any particular outcome beyond the next available movement. In the second half of the 20th century, the Belgian physicist Ilya Prigogine was working in a laboratory on a problem that had troubled the physical sciences for some time. The laws of thermodynamics appeared to say that order should tend toward disorder, that systems left to themselves should become less organized over time, not more. And yet everywhere in the natural world, complex ordered structures were arising spontaneously. The spiral patterns in a dish of reactive chemicals held at a sustained distance from equilibrium, the intricate organization of a living cell. The weather patterns that organize themselves into stable systems across thousands of kilometers. Prigogine found that when a system is held far from equilibrium by a continuous gentle flow of energy, it does not simply dissipate into disorder. Under the right conditions, it spontaneously organizes itself into a coherent, stable, complex pattern. Order arrives without being commanded. Structure emerges without a designer. The system finds a form that the mathematical equations can describe, but that no external agency had to impose. The parallel to the Daoist description of the Tao is structural rather than identical, and the distinction matters. Prigogine was doing physics, measuring specific chemical systems under controlled conditions, and his findings belong to the literature of thermodynamics rather than to the history of philosophy. What he found does not prove the Tao Te Ching correct, and the Tao Te Ching does not anticipate the mathematics of dissipative structures. But the two bodies of thought are noticing something recognizably related about the world, from very different angles and with very different instruments. The natural world organizes itself into coherent, stable, complex forms without requiring a central agency to impose that organization. This is what Prigogine's equations describe. This is what the Tao Te Ching's image of the 10,000 things arising through Ziran, of itself so, is pointing toward. The intuition behind Wu Wei, that interference with a self-organizing system tends to produce less order rather than more, has a kind of structural resonance with what complexity science finds when it looks carefully at how order actually arises in the world. That resonance is worth holding gently, without pressing it further than the evidence supports. The carpenter setting down tools at evening, the block of wood complete in its unhewn state, the spiral pattern forming in the still dish of chemicals as the energy flows through it without forcing. These are not the same thing, and they arise from entirely different traditions of inquiry, but they share a direction of attention. They are all looking at what happens when a system is allowed to proceed according to its own internal logic, rather than being overridden by external compulsion. What they find, each in its own vocabulary, is that something remarkable arises in that space of allowing, not chaos, not indifference, not the collapse of all structure into formlessness. Something more ordered than force could achieve, more precise than planning could arrange, more durable than anything imposed from outside. A forest in deep winter holds this quality in the most immediate and visible form. On the surface, the forest in December appears to have stopped, and the trees are bare. The undergrowth is flat and pale under frost. The birds that moved through the canopy in summer have gone, or gone quiet. A person walking through a winter forest for the first time and looking only at what is visible above the snow might conclude that nothing is happening, that the system is at rest in the sense of suspension, waiting for an external intervention to restart it in spring. This is not what is happening. Beneath the frozen surface, the root systems of the trees are continuing their slow and patient exchange. The mycorrhizal networks, the vast underground web of fungal filaments that connect tree roots across many meters, are still carrying sugars and minerals between the trees in the grove, the older trees supporting the younger ones, the ones in shadow receiving from the ones in light, the whole network maintaining a kind of circulation that does not pause for winter, but only slows to the tempo that winter allows. The seeds resting in the soil are not suspended, but held in a precise biochemical state that requires the cold in order to complete the preparation for germination. Remove the winter, and many seeds cannot germinate at all. The cold is not the interruption of the process. The cold is part of the process, as necessary as the warmth that follows it. Nothing in the forest consults a principle of growth. No tree decides to continue the underground exchange of nutrients through the long months of ice. No seed chooses to maintain the exact biochemical conditions required for spring germination. The whole process proceeds by its own internal logic, responding to the conditions it finds, temperature, moisture, light, with the precision of something that has been doing this for an enormous number of cycles, each cycle teaching nothing because nothing is forgotten. The learning carried not in any individual organism, but in the structure of the relationships between them. This is what the Tao Te Ching means when it says the Tao does nothing, and yet nothing is left undone. The formulation sounds contradictory, and it is meant to. The contradiction is the point, not the point of an argument to be won, but the point of an image that cannot be replaced by a more straightforward statement without losing the thing it is describing. The Tao does nothing in the sense that there is no ego at the center of it, no will imposing a plan, no external agency monitoring the outcome and adjusting the parameters. And yet the 10,000 things arise, the mycelia exchange, the seeds maintain their cold requirement. The river finds the gradient, the galaxy turns on the emptiness at its center. Nothing is left undone, not because someone is doing it, but because the doing and the not doing are the same thing, seen from two angles, the way the empty hub and the turning wheel are two aspects of a single motion. The Tao Te Ching's treatment of cycles deepens this picture. What appears to be doing nothing, the winter forest, the uncarved block, the wheel's empty hub, is not absence, but a necessary phase within a larger movement. Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching returns to the image of the 10,000 things rising and falling, flourishing and returning, and places at the center of this observation the word gui, returning. All things return to the root. The root is stillness. And from that stillness, without forcing, without intention, without any agency separate from the process itself, the next arising begins. The cycle does not require external assistance between one rising and the next. The returning to stillness and the arising from stillness are the same motion, the way the wave returning to the ocean and the ocean rising into the next wave are phases of a single continuous process that has no true resting point and no true beginning, a wheel turning in the dark with nothing at its center but air. This image from the Tao Te Ching is not finished when the turning stops. The wheel continues to do what only the emptiness can do, even when no one is watching, even when the journey has paused and the wheel is still. The still wheel is still a wheel. The empty hub is still what makes it useful. The form persists through the stillness, and the stillness is what the form rests in, and neither the form nor the stillness is more fundamental than the other, and the motion when it returns arises from the stillness, the way the river arises from the stillness of the source. High in the mountains, without planning the canyon, it will eventually make. There is something that the water chapters and the cycle chapters and the Pu chapters of the Tao Te Ching are all pointing toward, though they point from different angles and with different images. It is the recognition that the intelligence organizing the world is not like the intelligence of a strategist, working through deliberate calculation toward a predetermined outcome. It is more like the intelligence of the river, distributed through every part of the system, present in every adjustment to every stone, expressing itself completely in each moment, without withholding anything in reserve for a future calculation. The river does not have a plan for the canyon. The canyon is what happens when the river expresses itself completely in each moment, with no reservation and no strategic withdrawal. The result is more precise than any plan could have produced, because the plan would have had to anticipate the particular arrangement of every stone, and no plan can do that. What the human being reaches toward in the practice of Wu Wei is not the elimination of intelligence or the abandonment of attentiveness, but something closer to this distributed, moment by moment, fully responsive quality, the disposition of the river, rather than the disposition of the strategist. Not less aware, but aware differently. Not less present to what is happening, but present without the layer of calculating deliberation that inserts a delay between perception and response, between what the situation requires and what the ego decides to provide. The delay is where the striving lives. The striving is the gap between what the situation already knows it needs and what the deliberating mind is deciding to offer. The river has no gap of this kind. Its response to each stone is simultaneous with its encounter with that stone. This is not mindlessness. It is something harder to achieve than the most careful deliberation, because it requires the dissolution of the part of the mind that is monitoring its own performance. Out in the open, away from any city, on a night when the cloud cover has thinned enough for the stars to show, the sky demonstrates the same quality of unhurried completeness that the river and the winter forest and the turning wheel each demonstrate from closer in. The stars are not arranged to be seen. The light they send has been traveling for distances so large that the numbers used to express them have ceased to carry any felt sense of scale. No part of what is visible above an open field on a clear night is waiting for a response, or aiming at an outcome, or monitoring whether the observer is finding it adequate. The whole enormous self-organizing system is simply proceeding according to its own internal logic, as it has been proceeding for a time so long that human history occupies something less than a single breath of it. The Tao that Laozi was pointing toward is not smaller than this. The Tao Te Ching is not a book about human beings finding peace in a world that is, when seen fully, something else entirely. It is an attempt to name the quality that the stars and the river and the winter forest and the turning wheel all share, and to describe the human disposition that most closely mirrors that quality. Wu Wei is the name of that mirroring. The unhewn block sits in the carpenter's workshop, and the night settles around it. The tools are resting on their shelf. The fire in the hearth has come down to coals, and the coals are giving their heat to the room without deciding to, without monitoring whether the room is warm enough, without reserving any portion of the heat for a later calculation. The whole interior world of the workshop is proceeding by its own logic, the wood expanding and contracting slightly with the changing temperature of the air, the tools resting in the particular arrangement the craftsman has given them over years of use, the coals completing their slow passage from fire back to ash. None of it is being managed. All of it is happening completely and precisely, without any gap between what the process is and what the process does. The block of wood in its unhewn state, rough on its surface, carrying the memory of the tree it came from in the pattern of its grain, is complete, not in the sense that it is finished, in the sense that nothing is missing from it. All its possible forms are still folded inside it. The chisel will open one and close the others, and the opening will create something useful and perhaps beautiful, and the closing will be real. But the block in this moment, before the first cut, is not lacking the form the chisel will eventually reveal. It is prior to it, and prior in the only way that contains the future without limiting it. This is what Laozi meant by pui, not in completion, the particular fullness of everything that has not yet been foreclosed. A body preparing for sleep is in some sense approaching the same condition. The day's accumulation, the plans made and revised, the calculations run and discarded, the striving maintained across long hours of deliberate engagement, all of it has been building toward a threshold at which the deliberating mind is asked to do the hardest thing it knows how to do. Stop deliberating, not because sleep is the absence of activity. The body asleep is not inactive. Every system that the waking mind overrides or interferes with has been waiting for the cessation of that interference so that it can attend to the work that cannot be done while the strategic overlay is running. The restoration happens not because something is added to the sleeping state, but because something is released from it. The backwards law in its most intimate form. The night moves around the carpenter's workshop, and around the winter forest, and around the canyon where the river is still finding its way through the dark. And in each of these places, something is happening that no watching would improve. The water moves without being encouraged. The mycelia exchange without being instructed. The stars send their light across the enormous distances without being aimed. The wheel's empty hub holds the motion it makes possible without being thanked for the holding. The whole vast self-organizing process of the world continues in the dark exactly as it continues in the light, because nothing in the process requires the light in order to proceed. Somewhere in all of this, in the patient current moving around stones, it will eventually outlast, in the wood that holds all its possible forms before the first cut. If you kind of pickets, prespont for us pomage wisely, in the cold ground that holds the seed in exactly the biochemical condition that spring will make use of. Somewhere in all of this is the thing that the 81 chapters of the Tao Te Ching spent their compressed and inexhaustible attention trying to name, not a strategy for living better, not a technique for achieving more through less effort, not a counterintuitive productivity method disguised in ancient language. Something older and quieter than any of those things, and more patient than any of them can afford to be. What appears to be doing nothing may be doing the most essential work. The root systems continuing their slow exchange under the ice, the empty hub carrying what the spokes cannot carry, the still point at the center of the turning from which the turning proceeds without requiring any further agency, the apparent rest that contains already everything the arising will need, and the body that is crossing now toward the territory the day cannot follow it into, the breath slowing to the tempo that the night allows, the long interior systems coming forward as the deliberating mind begins to step back, each quiet, autonomous process, taking up again the work it has been doing, in the dark, all the long life of the body, without instruction, without effort, without any distance at all between what the process is and what the process unhurriedly does. In a room that had been arranged for ceremony, Emperor Wen of Han sat in plain clothing on a chair that was not a throne. His ministers had come with silk and ritual intention, with the banners and formalities appropriate to the occasion of an emperor's honor, and he had looked at all of it for a long moment before declining, quietly, with a small gesture of his hand that asked them to take it away, not with anger, not with performance, simply with the settled clarity of a man who had decided some time earlier that the most powerful thing available to him was a certain quality of plainness. The room he returned to was sparsely furnished and lit without extravagance, and the empire was, by most accounts, recovering. This happened in the 2nd century before the Common Era, after decades of exhausting conflict had worn the Han state and its people down past the point where more government could have helped. The historians who recorded Wen's reign noted something that continued to puzzle those who inherited the standard Confucian assumption that leadership required assertive moral example, constant presence, and the display of virtuous effort. They noted that the period flourished, taxation fell. Legal codes were simplified to the point of near transparency. The elaborate ceremonies that courts tend to accumulate around themselves, like additional walls, were quietly set aside, and the people, left to their own arrangements without the weight of aggressive administration pressing down on every season of planting and harvest, organized their lives with a competence that no minister had needed to instruct. What Wen had understood or inhabited, which is not the same as understanding, was that a government could be most itself by doing less, that the most useful thing the state could sometimes offer was a sustained, deliberate restraint. There is a word for this disposition, worn into Chinese philosophical thought by many centuries of careful use: wu wei, the absence of purposeful striving, not the absence of action altogether, but the absence of the anxious, self-promoting, agenda-driven kind of action that overrides the natural intelligence of things. Wen had not studied the Tao Te Ching as a policy manual or taken its verses as instructions for administration. He had arrived by some combination of temperament and circumstance at a condition the text had been describing since it was composed, the condition of the person who governs a large country, the way one cooks a small fish, the old phrase goes, with a light hand and without turning it too often. Wu wei, understood this way, is not a doctrine held in the mind. It is a quality inhabited by the body, expressed through gesture, through the tone of a request, through what a person declines as much as through what they pursue. Emperor Wen's refusal of the silken ceremony was not an argument for Wu Wei. It was Wu Wei. The distinction matters. Every philosophy that can be demonstrated rather than merely stated has already arrived somewhere that argument alone cannot reach. Across the long tradition that flows from the Tao Te Ching and the commentary and practice it generated, there are figures who knew this. The calligrapher who held the brush above the blank surface and waited, not for inspiration, which is too romantic a word for what was happening, not for instruction from somewhere outside himself, simply waited until the quality of waiting itself had become a kind of readiness, a loosening of the self's grip on the outcome, so that when the brush moved, it moved from something older and more settled than the practitioner's intentions. Xu Wei, who wrote and painted in the 16th century with a ferocity that contained within it a peculiar quality of abandon, as though the anger and the grief and the wildness in his work had found their way through him rather than being directed by him, was understood by those who came after him as someone whose life had, through suffering and through loss of the kind no one would choose, arrived at a kind of radical openness. His best brushstrokes were read as strokes in which the ego's preference for safety and coherence had been so thoroughly dissolved that something else moved the brush, not a mystical force, not divine inspiration, something more like the painter's own deepest nature, liberated from the performance of itself. Shitao, a generation later, wrote about this in his treatise on painting with a clarity that is still difficult to receive without slowing down. He described the single brushstroke, Yi Hua, as the origin of all things, the first movement that contains within it the entire painting's possibility. Before the stroke, there is potential. After the stroke, there is commitment. The stroke itself is the moment of Wu Wei, neither the stillness before nor the elaboration after, but the instant of movement that is also an instance of not deciding, the brush finding its way across the surface with the same undeliberated rightness that water finds in running downhill. A painter who understands this does not begin by planning. Planning is the mind's way of preparing for a future it is afraid of, and the fear of the future is exactly what the tradition asks to be set down. The blank surface is not a problem requiring a solution. It is a field of possibility requiring a quality of presence, the same quality Emperor Wen brought to his underfurnished room, the same quality the water brings to the stone it has been quietly outlasting for 1,000 years. This is not a metaphor for relaxation, for a mipiu. It is a precise description of a different relationship to action than the one that most people, in most of their hours, actually inhabit. The ordinary relationship to action involves calculation. What will this achieve? What will it cost? How will it appear? Is it enough? These questions are not wrong. They have their uses, but they are not the only available relationship to the moment of doing something, and the tradition keeps insisting, across centuries and across the different media in which it found expression, that there is another way of acting that is qualitatively different from this anxious management of outcomes. Sen no Rikyu knew this and built it into stone and clay in the specific silence of a small room. The tea master of the 16th century designed and refined a practice, wabi cha, the way of rustic tea that was explicitly an argument against the extravagance and competitive display that defined the political culture of his time, a Japan of warring rulers, of elaborate ceremony used as a language of power, of art valued for its costliness and its display of possession. Rikyu took the act of preparing and drinking tea and stripped it of everything that served those functions. The room he favored was small enough to make hierarchy almost geometrically impossible. too small for anyone to be more impressive than anyone else, too spare to offer any surface on which status could be displayed. The bowls were rough and irregular, their imperfections not apologized for, but held as the most interesting thing about them. The scroll in the alcove was chosen for its quietness. The flowers, if there were flowers, were a single stem, placed without arrangement, in a plain vessel that made no claim. What Rikyū was designing was an experience of wu-wei, not a doctrine being explained, but a space in which a quality of attention became possible, that ordinary life, with its hierarchies and its purposes and its constant requirement to manage impression, made almost unavailable. Inside the tea room, the act of receiving a bowl, the act of turning it in the hands, the act of drinking from it, these were restored to themselves. They were not performances of appreciation. They were just the act, the bowl, the hands, and the quiet that held all three, without requiring anything more. What remains after the guests leave and the ceremony ends is not nothing. The room holds a quality that persists after the people who filled it have gone. This is what the tradition points to when it talks about the difference between doing something and being something. The tea room continues to be what it is, regardless of whether a ceremony is currently happening inside it. And the person who has spent enough time inside that quality of simplicity begins, eventually, to carry some version of it wherever they go, not consciously, not as a posture, the way water carries the memory of the stone it has been running over, not as knowledge, but as the shape of how it moves. There is a courtyard somewhere in China that opens before first light, where a single figure moves through a form so slowly that the movement is nearly indistinguishable from stillness. Tai Chi Chuan, the internal martial art, whose philosophy runs back through centuries of Daoist thought, asks the practitioner to do something that seems at first like a contradiction, to move and to listen at the same time, to extend the arm through a gesture while remaining completely attentive to the quality of sensation in every part of the body involved in that extension, to be simultaneously active and receptive. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual instruction. Taiyong, the unity of body and function, the cultivated state in which the body is not an instrument being operated from behind the eyes, but a whole, listening, responsive field. The figure moves. One gesture takes the entire length of a breath, not because the pace has been artificially slowed for effect, but because at this depth of attention, there is no reason to move faster. The question that drives most human movement, what is the next thing, and how quickly can the current thing be completed so the next thing can begin, has gone quiet. What remains when that question goes quiet is not blankness, it is a particular quality of aliveness. The body feels the weight of its own arm differently. The ground beneath the feet becomes more present. The breath, which has been moving all along without being attended to, arrives in awareness as something both simple and extraordinary, just air, just the chest, just the perpetual exchange that requires nothing from consciousness to continue. The martial dimension of Tai Chi is not incidental to its philosophy. The tradition holds that in genuine contact with an opponent, the practitioner cultivates extreme sensitivity to the other person's intention, not reading it through analysis, not anticipating it through strategy, but feeling it through the quality of contact itself, the way the pressure shifts in someone's grip, a fraction of a second before they move, meeting that force not with counterforce, but with softness, not absorbing it, not resisting it, but redirecting it, the force finding no fixed point to push against, sliding through the yielding into the space it was not prepared for. This is wu-wei as embodied technique, the softest thing overcoming the hardest, not through strength, through a quality of listening that has become, through practice, the practitioner's natural condition. Something in this is very old, older than the texts that describe it. There is something in the human body that already knows how to do this, that knows in the right conditions how to stop fighting what is happening and simply allow the intelligence of the whole body, its deep proprioceptive sense of itself in space, to take the movement wherever it needs to go. This knowledge is suppressed in most people by the accumulated habit of muscular tension, the shoulders that have been held up for decades against something, the jaw that has been braced, the breath that has been kept shallow because at some point breathing deeply felt like too much exposure. The practice of Tai Chi is not the installation of a new ability. It is the slow, patient return to something that was never absent, only buried. The Daoist medical tradition understood this and made it precise. The Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of internal medicine, composed and compiled over centuries and reaching something like its canonical form in the early Common Era, holds a view of the body's relationship to night that reads now not as antique belief, but as something very close to what sleep science has spent decades discovering without the philosophical vocabulary to fully articulate. Yang energy, active, outward, purposeful, governs the day. It rises with the light and is spent through effort and engagement in the thousand small decisions that constitute a waking life. Yin energy, receptive, inward, consolidating, is the nature of night, and what night is for, in the Neijing's account, is the replenishment of exactly what the day has spent. But, and this is the part the tradition insists on, yin consolidation cannot happen while yang activity continues. The body's deep restorative work is not compatible with striving. It cannot run alongside calculation, alongside the rehearsal of tomorrow's difficulties, alongside the vigilance that keeps the jaw braced and the breath tight. It requires, as a literal physiological condition, the cessation of the yang activities, speech, the visual processing of the outer world, the forward planning mind, so that the body's autonomous intelligence can take over the whole house and do what it knows without any instruction how to do. The depth of restoration is proportional to the quality of release. This is not a claim about willpower or discipline. It is an observation about what the body does when it is allowed to. When the conditions for yin consolidation are genuinely present, when the darkness is real, and the silence is real, and the body has arrived at something like surrender, the work that happens in the interior is as elaborate and as intelligent as anything the waking mind has managed all day. More so, in some respects, the immune processes that survey and repair, the metabolic sorting that separates what the body can use from what needs to be cleared, the memory consolidation that takes the day's accumulation of experience and quietly, without any participation from the conscious mind, files some of it and releases the rest. The body in sleep is not idle. It is engaged in exactly the kind of non-action that the whole tradition has been pointing toward. Purposeful without striving, precise without deliberation, doing exactly what the moment requires without the commentary of self-consciousness running alongside it. This is Wu Wei in its most intimate form, not as philosophy, not as practice, as the given condition of the body when the body is finally trusted to do what it knows how to do. The difficulty, and it is a real difficulty, one the tradition acknowledged without pretending it away, is that the body cannot simply be commanded to arrive at this state. The instruction to relax cannot be followed in the same way that the instruction to lift the arm can be followed. The instruction to sleep cannot be obeyed by the same mechanisms that obey other instructions. This is precisely the paradox that Wu Wei was always trying to address. The thing that is needed cannot be obtained by trying for it. The trying is the obstacle. The more carefully and urgently a person attempts to fall asleep, the more precisely they have recreated the conditions that make sleep impossible. The vigilance, the monitoring, the self-consciousness, the yang energy directed inward to manage what can only happen when management has been set down. The Daoist response to this paradox is not a technique, it is an orientation. The shift from trying to get sleep to allowing the body to do what it always does when not prevented. This is a genuine shift, and it is available, and it is the thing that every dimension of the tradition is circling. Whether the text is describing Laozi's water finding the lowest ground, or Zhuangzi's cook whose knife moves through the natural spaces in things, or Wang Bi's sage who governs by emptying himself of self-interested calculation, or Rikyu's tea room that holds its quality regardless of who enters it. The same thing, described from many angles, pointing always toward the same territory, the state in which something other than the anxious managing self is in charge. This is not the state of being unconscious. The calligrapher waiting above the blank surface is not unconscious. The Tai Chi practitioner moving through the courtyard in the dark is not unconscious. Emperor Wen, declining the ceremony, was fully present, entirely engaged with the situation he was in. The state the tradition describes is not the absence of awareness, but a different quality of it. The awareness that does not narrate itself, that does not compare the present moment to what it might have been or could yet become, that simply rests inside what is actually happening and allows that to be, for this moment, sufficient. In the long, quiet tradition of Daoist thought, there is a phrase that appears across texts and commentaries and centuries of practice, returning to the root. Guijin. It is the movement described in Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching, the return of the 10,000 things to the stillness from which they came, not as death, not as defeat, but as the natural rhythm of any living system. Things flower, and then they settle. Things extend, and then they return. This is not loss. This is the structure of what it means to be alive in time. The root is not somewhere the plant goes when it has failed to remain in bloom. The root is what makes bloom possible in the first place. The return to the root is the restoration of what makes all the outward extension viable. Night is the return to the root, not metaphorically. In the Neijing's understanding, in the Yangsheng tradition's careful attention to the conditions of genuine restoration, and in the body's own demonstrated intelligence across every night of a human life, night is literally the time when the organism returns to something more primary, more self-organizing, more interior. The yang activities of the waking life recede. The yang activities of consolidation and repair come forward. The outward-facing awareness that spent the day processing and deciding and managing becomes quiet, and what is left is the body's own deep knowing of what it needs to do. Sen no Rikyu's tea room, after the last guest has gone, the bowls back in their places, the fire cooling in the hearth, the scroll in the alcove containing whatever it was that it contained, some verse, some figure, some brushstroke made by someone who knew how to let the brush move, and the silence in the room, not emptier than it was during the ceremony, but in some way fuller, as though what happened in it has been absorbed by the walls and the floor and the simple irregular vessels, and remains there, unhurried, asking nothing. There is a quality of attention that becomes available in the last minutes before sleep that is not available in the ordinary waking hours. The edges of things soften, the hard categories of the day. This is urgent, this is a problem, this requires resolution, begin to loosen their hold. not because the problems have been solved, but because the part of the mind that holds things as problems is beginning to release its grip, and in that releasing something else becomes briefly, gently perceptible, something that has been there all day, underneath the planning and the worrying and the management of impression, but that the noise of those activities kept quiet. The tradition would call this the beginning of the return, the first loosening of the ordinary self's grip on the situation of being itself. Not dissolution. The self does not disappear at the threshold of sleep. It simply becomes less insistent about its own centrality. And in that slight easing, something can be felt that the waking hours make difficult to perceive. The body's own extraordinary competence, its unhurried and reliable knowledge of what to do with the hours that are coming. The breath is the clearest evidence of this. It has been moving all day, through the conversation, through the meal, through the problem that took up the morning, through the decision that took up the afternoon, through whatever the evening held, without once requiring instruction. The breath did not need to be remembered. It did not need to be managed. It moved through the body's need and the body's capacity with the same unhurried adequacy that water moves through a good drainage system, finding the gradient, following the available space, never forcing what does not need to be forced. And it continues now, in the dark, in the stillness of a body that is beginning to arrive at the threshold of sleep. The chest rises, and then it settles. The exhale is a little longer than the inhale, a little quieter, a little more complete. This is not something happening to the body from outside. This is the body doing what it has always done, in the form it has always taken, at the pace that requires exactly as much effort as this particular moment needs, and no more. The Tao Te Ching's water flows to the lowest places because the lowest places are where it fits. There is no other reason. There is no consulting. There is no decision in the ordinary sense of a decision, no deliberation, no alternative considered and rejected. There is only the water and the gradient and the long, unhurried movement that results when something is in complete alignment with what is actually available to it. The body in the dark, the breath moving, the heart keeping its quiet count without a keeper, the immune system conducting its survey with no report due until morning, the memory settling itself into the shapes that sleep will confirm, and the shapes that sleep will quietly dissolve. All of this happening at once, in the same interior, with a coordination so intricate and so reliable that no engineering has yet come close to describing it fully, and none of it requiring a single conscious instruction from the person inside whose body it is occurring. This is the plain, unadorned, verifiable version of the thing the tradition has been describing in verse and parable and commentary and embodied practice across 2,500 years. Not as mysticism, not as poetry, though poetry has been its most natural medium, as the simple, available, nightly truth of what happens when the self stops trying to manage the body it inhabits and allows the body's own intelligence, older than language, older than philosophy, older than the first character ever pressed into wet clay, to do what it has always known how to do. Emperor Wen in his plain room, Rikyu in his small tea room after the last guest, the calligrapher's brush resting beside the dried ink, the Tai Chi practitioner completing the form in the courtyard before anyone else in the city has stirred, standing still for a moment in the posture that ends the movement, the body warm and quiet and satisfied by its own patience, the water in the dark, moving, the root underground, holding, the seed in the cold soil, doing nothing that can be seen and doing everything that needs to be done, The breath rises, the breath falls, not because it is instructed to, not because anyone is managing it, because this is what the breath does, because this is what it has always done, because somewhere in the body's oldest knowledge, in the part of it that does not require a waking mind to operate, there is a competence so thorough and so patient that it requires only one thing from the consciousness that rides inside it, that it put down for these hours the effort of being in charge. The putting down is not a defeat, it is the thing that makes all the rest possible. Every morning that follows a deep night follows a night in which the body was trusted. Every clarity that arrives on the other side of sleep arrives because something on this side was willing to stop managing and allow the restoration that comes naturally to a system left to run without interference.